Hello, Michael Hay here again, and welcome to audio blog number 6. I guess Mr. Blue is deciding to help with this one because I can't seem to get him off my lap, so if you hear purring in the background, that would be his contribution. As promised, this segment is on organizing your thoughts or your author notes, as I promised last time. I'm going to try and keep this one under 15 minutes, but I don't think I can do that, so we'll see what we get. I'm going to entitle this segment How to Organize Your Brain, and what that really means is metacognition, which is just a fancy way of saying thinking about how you think. So basically, we're going to try a couple of different organizational styles that I know of and some I may have created. And if you're following this, I would like you to try some of them if you think they would work for you and actually analyze which ones do work for you, because obviously the one that'll work for you best will be the one that you utilize. So let me start with my personal favorite, and this is the one I use, and that is the point form note. There's nothing fancy about this style. It's just little tiny points about what you wish to write about. And usually they're the main points, kind of the high points of the action, but not necessarily. So for this segment, I made a little tiny story just kind of as I went along. And so my main points are as such. It's going to be a river town setting. There's two brothers who are merchants, and they will be the main characters. And the idea of the story is they lose a shipment on the river, and then maybe they lose another one, and eventually they have to go upstream to locate the problem, and then their random and crazy adventure ensues. When I record point form notes, I try to keep them in chronological order. And if I'm working on a computer, this is a lot easier to do, obviously because of the ease in which you can use Word documents. But if you're recording by hand, this becomes a little more difficult, but not impossible. So I will get all my point form notes in chronological order, and then from there I start writing. I literally start writing in the list, and it slowly expands outward into full sentences, and eventually this expands out into a book. So my points become more and more detailed, such as they inherited the business from their father, and the boat that they will eventually take upstream is a flat-bottom paddle steamer. And eventually I expand those notes so far that they become mini stories, and then they turn into full paragraphs and sentences and chapters, and that is my book. As it turns out, I believe this is the way J.R.R. Tolkien operated, and I didn't find that out until recently, but I have a very similar style. He would just keep point form notes through the ages of what was happening, and then he'd expand upon his notes, and his whole books would be just formed inside of these point form note lists. So this way is tried, tested, and true. And point form, for those of you that may not know, is just a small sentence stripped away of all the unnecessary words. It says in the most basic way what's happening. And it doesn't include proper punctuation or proper sentence structure or anything like that. It's just the facts in as short a point as possible. If you are technologically inclined, and I'm not sure how to do this, so don't ask me, but I imagine it can be done. You could make a single list, perhaps in a word processor, and hyperlink all those points to the relevant chapters or pages that you're writing. So if that is the case, I imagine each chapter you would write would be a separate Word file in of itself. And this might work for you. I could foresee it working for me, though I don't know how to hyperlink like that. But again, I'm sure it's possible. And like I said, point form notes is the most effective way for me to organize myself. Sometimes when I'm writing, I'll just stop in the middle of the chapter, and then the end of it is just a series of point form notes, meaning I know where I want the chapter to go, but for whatever reason, if I have to do more research, or even if I don't feel like writing that at the time, at least I've captured the main idea and I know where it's going to go. But that is an old and formal way of looking at things, so I will demonstrate to you some of the ways that I have also learned to record notes, and though they don't work for me, they may in fact work for you. So one idea is the sunburst. And that is, you take a starting central idea, maybe the idea for the book, and from there you take little spokes off and add detailed information. So here I've recorded the setting, and then I've recorded that there are two brothers, and from the two brothers spoke, I would actually put what their names are, and you can see how I've done this. And eventually, as time goes on, and you branch off more and more with more spokes, you will get something that generally looks like this. And this style is actually quite popular, which is why I put it second, because I've seen a fair number of people using it. Also quite popular is just writing in full paragraph forms. Like you just start chapter 1, sentence 1, and you just start writing and you write all the way through the book and you never record any notes at all. But that requires a level of organization that I do not myself possess. Though that is originally how I wrote The Guardian, that was only 25,000 words. I wrote it from beginning to end in full sentence and paragraph form, but I had to go back in and flush out 40,000 words worth of explanation, which is how I came across the idea for the point form, and you go in and expand upon your points, like I just mentioned a moment ago. But to be able to write like this from beginning to end without ever taking any notes, that you have to, well, that's a lot to keep in your brain. So I don't recommend it, though it might be the best way to go. And if it works for you, by all means do it. And something that I became aware of while making these audio blogs is that you can actually take audio notes and listen to them again while you're trying to work, instead of, say, listening to music. The image that you see is a screen capture from Audacity, which is the program that I use to make my audio blogs, at least the audio track of the blogs. And I have found as I've made them that I like to go back and listen to my blogs, not because I'm a narcissist or anything, but because I'm listening to myself and I make sense to myself when I speak. I mean, it's how I speak is my thought pattern, so when I hear it, my own voice spoken back to me, I instantly make sense of what's going on. So I can foresee keeping audio notes in the future, but right now I'm just not situated to do that. In the olden days, you had a little handheld recorder with a little tiny magnetic tape cassette that went in it, and I imagine there's a digital version of that these days, though I've never seen one. I think they've kind of gone out of style, but I could foresee using one if ever I had the money to do so, because speaking to my laptop all day long would just be silly. And the next style of organization was actually used by Charles Dickens. If I remember my history correctly, he would take a single page per chapter that he was going to write, and he would hang them up in a row on the wall so he could physically see what each chapter would be about. And I kind of like this idea because on each individual page you could record your notes in different styles. As I have demonstrated here, I have the point form on one page, I have a sunburst on another page, and then I just have a full paragraph on another page. And the question marks are for unforeseen recording devices, like perhaps you would even just hang a single picture that makes you think of what the chapter is going to be, or perhaps you use one of the other styles that I will get to in this blog. And I like this page by page style, though I've only used the style that you now see before you, and that was for a choose your own adventure way back in the 8th grade. And of course, because it's a choose your own adventure, it doesn't read straight through in a chronological order. So this, as you can see, you start with page 1, and then page 1 leads to the choice where you can either turn to page 2 or page 3. And page 2 leads to page 15, but on page 15 you have to make a choice, as is the nature of a choose your own adventure, and that will lead you to either page 9 or page 6. And quite frankly, this is the only way I know to map your way through choose your own adventure, though I don't think they're that popular anymore these days, those choose your own adventure books, but I've always thought about writing like a serious adult novel in a choose your own adventure style. So this may be useful for you. Or it might just be the different journeys of a character. So on what I have for page 2 and page 3, it might be two characters split apart on page 1, and each kind of branch is just its own story following that character. Or you might find some other use for this system. I don't know what they are, but by all means experiment with it. So similar to the chapter by chapter overview or the page by page overview is what I call the storyboard. Storyboards are generally used for making movies, and if you follow the links and watch my Carpe Noctem video, which was the video I made in communications class in high school, that was entirely storyboarded before we began filming. So we had a very good idea of where the action was going. But I can foresee this being used for writing, because if you're the type of person that likes to doodle, and you kind of doodle in like a sort of a comic style with action, and you can kind of foresee the story that's going to it, you might want to take all those little doodles and tack them to a page. What I have here is a simple ball falling, and it's got the action arrows to show you where it's going, and the little I don't know what you'd call them, poof marks, where it hits the ground and eventually the ball bounces, and that's what you see recorded here. And you could record this page by page or chapter by chapter, or maybe even just significant events in the telling of the story. Whichever one you choose, though, I would just suggest that you keep it consistent, because if you're switching between this is a page, but this is a significant event, and this is an entire chapter, you might get confused. But if you feel you need to do that, by all means do it, but it wouldn't be my suggestion. I'm more of a logical, point by point, straightforward thinker, which is why point form notes work for me. So the next style is something you've probably all seen, and I remember seeing this in public school, and it is the plot graph. So you have the introduction to your story, you have the rising action, you have the climax, or the most exciting point in the story, and then you have a short fall in falling action, and then the conclusion. Now, at certain points on that graph, you can record certain events, and you might record these events in point form style. Or, as I've demonstrated here, you might include some of the other styles of organization. Like you could just as easily put a sunburst on this plot graph, or write a very concise paragraph or a couple of sentences. You may even wish to take your chapter by chapter overview and put it on this graph so you can see the rise and the fall of the action. So within the contents of the chapter, you know how exciting it should be. I was sick to death of plot graphs and they never worked for me, but that's probably why I remember it from public school. And I don't think I remember anybody ever liking how to do that. But I can't deny that it is useful to show the rise and the fall of the action, which is what it was designed for. Next is the organizational style of timelines, and though I've tried to use these before, they didn't work for me. So what I tried to do was make a little line for each character, and along that line, in chronological order, I would put points of what happens during the story. And the idea is that it lines up with the other timelines. So as you can see, the brothers, shortly after finding out their lost shipment, meet the unnamed dock worker. And at some point, Herman gets an arrow in the knee, then there is the death of that dock worker, and then poor Siegfried gets malaria. So that happening in a short amount of time on the timeline there says that they're probably all related. So arrow in the knee, dead dock worker, I can foresee an attack, maybe they escape off into a jungle, which is where Siegfried gets malaria. And then for some reason, eventually Herman finds a puppy. I can see how this is useful to know where your characters are at what time. So when Herman finds the puppy, he might be separated from Siegfried at that moment. And if you're trying to remember what Siegfried was doing at that exact moment in time, it will be marked on the timeline. And though I've given each character their own line, you could just as easily give a city or a place on a map its own timeline just to show what's going on in that area at that time. And though you might not include all points that you have written, sometimes it is useful to know exactly where everyone in your book is in the world at any given moment, especially if they're going off on their own.